And today we're going to explore clothiers of all types, clothing store owners, tailors, hatters, bootmakers, glove makers, and just boring old tailors. And we even have a laundress that's going to throw in there. And if you're really nice to me, we'll talk about corsets later. No kids here, right? Okay. Okay, it's kind of loud right here, so we're going to get started and get moving into the cemetery. But first I want to say the cemetery started in 1849 with a grant of 10 acres from John Sutter Jr. And there's a memorial plaque right there for him. John Sutter Jr. always felt that he got kind of bamboozled out of his land by a bunch of sharp characters, some of who are buried here also. And he left in disgust after getting swindled out of his land to Acapulco, and only came back to Sacramento once to testify in court. And he said Sacramento was the place that he liked least in the world. And when Acapulco needed more land for development in the 1960s, they dug him up and sent him back here to Sacramento, to the place he liked least in the world. So, thank you, John Sutter. Right over on the other side of that car by that kiosk, there's some information about future upcoming tours, and there's also an Iron Ranger built into the ground. And if you feel like donating money, you can put it in there and it will be secure. We're all volunteers. We don't take any money. All the money goes towards upkeep of the cemetery. So, with all that said, let's move on this way and get started. Oh, I forgot. Before I let Juliana talk, I'm going to start out. We're going to end the tour with the story about a Hummel, Joseph Hummel, who is a tailor. So we're going to start with a tale about August Hummel, who is also a tailor, who quit the tailoring trade and bought a pickle and vinegar manufactory on K and 4th Street. He committed suicide in his room by this is from the newspaper account, cutting a frightful gash longitudinally in the region of his bowels.
Ooh, nice.
One of the workmen passed by the room and saw him suffering and went in to help him. And he said, just put the blanket over me. And when he did, he saw the frightful gash and said, why'd you do it? You're going to bleed to death. He said that he wanted to. Physicians were sent for who sewed up the wound, but it didn't help very much because he had nicked his liver and the small intestines. He said that he had actually stabbed himself with a butcher knife, and when that death did not come right away, he enlarged the wound with a razor. And then stood up on the floor. The floor of the room was covered in blood as he stood as long as he could before he could not stand anymore. Now, with that wonderful introduction, Maddie, see, I didn't give you all the gross, bloody stories. I held one out. Mourning clothes were very important. Well, clothes of all types were important to the Victorians, but mourning clothes had a very special significance. And Juliana, take it away.
How do I follow a story like that? Really? All right, well, I often get asked, because I do a lot of the kids' tours, I get asked by the little kids, why are you wearing black? And of course it's for mourning. And the Victorians had a very interesting relationship with death. Sometimes it's called the celebration of death. And there were very specific rules about what you wore when different people in your family would have passed away. So they had 3 types of mourning. There was deep mourning or heavy mourning. And during that period of time, the women would wear a very opaque dress. It was made of crepe, not the kind of crepe we have now. It's very dull fabric because they didn't want women to look like they were at all celebrating anything. So it was very dull. And if your husband died, a widow would wear that usually for about a year and a day. So you'd wear this dark dress, and then you'd have a veil of crepe, which is opaque, over your face. And the thing about the veil is that sometimes it would kind of mildew if it got wet, and the dye would flake off. So you would be breathing that in as you're wearing this veil. So not very good for you. Some doctors said that they didn't think people should be wearing them because it caused eye problems. But of course it was fashion, so people kept wearing them, much like high heels. So they would be in mourning for a year and a day for their spouse, whether or not they liked their spouse. Didn't matter. And there were a few reasons for the veil especially, or for the color of black, is that, number one, if you were in mourning, people could tell. And they wouldn't come around you with their sort of excited, happy feeling while you're in mourning. So it was very obvious. And also, if you did not like your husband very much and you were kind of secretly happy about it, you had that veil, and who knew? You were maybe crying under there. So you had to wear that. And if you didn't go through these proper stages of mourning, you would be shunned. So after heavy or deep mourning, you would go into first or full mourning, and that was where you'd probably wear the same dress, but you could have white collars and white cuffs, and then you would be there 3 to 6 months, and then you'd move on to second or half mourning, which is pretty much what I am. You could start adding little black flowers. Oh, and in full mourning, the first or full, you could trade out your veil for something a little bit lighter. But in the half mourning, that was when you could change out colors. So you could have mauve or purple, gray, a little bit different. So women were expected to be in mourning for anywhere from 18 months to 2 years for a husband. It was less time if you had a child that died, less than a year. It was less time for your parents. And if you had a brother or sister, an aunt and uncle, a cousin that died, you would go into second mourning. So you wouldn't do the full mourning with the long veil. So, and I read that black was used because from ancient times, people believed that the spirits could not see black. So I read somewhere that they said that widows were expected to wear black because they thought their husbands wouldn't be able to wouldn't be able to come back and bother them. Which is kind of funny because men didn't have a lot of like sort of mourning rules. They would wear the band here or around their hats. So if you watch Downton Abbey and you notice when that year, season 3, when everybody died, they were wearing the mourning bands. So anyway, that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you, Juliana.
Back to the guts and gore.
All right, guts and gore this way. Wait until this.
Yeah, I will. Okay. Okay, we don't know where Ciriaco Brancoli is buried, so I'm standing here because it's a convenient spot, that's all. We know he's in this area somewhere. We don't know much at all about Ciriaco Brancoli, and Eric had helped me with research, and if he couldn't find it, then it doesn't exist, because he's an excellent researcher. But I can tell you a few facts about Ciriaco. He was from Italy. He was a shoemaker. He lived in San Francisco for a while, and then he moved to Sacramento. He was married to a woman named Margarita Perini. She died, but we don't know when she died or where she's buried. We really don't know much about Ciriaco. He was a member of the Bersaglieri Society, which was an Italian fraternal organization, and he was also a member of the Red Men, which, oddly enough, was only for white men. Go figure. But we know one thing about Ciriaco Brancoli. We know that in 1890 he became depressed for some reason. Perhaps his wife had just died. And he gave up his job as a shoemaker. And he was idle for a few months. And his friends said he did a lot of drinking during that time. One day in 1890, a man was walking along J Street, and he was walking past a large building that had been a planing mill, but was now being used as a carpet beating establishment. It was probably a big warehouse-type building. And the business was closed for the day, but the man heard moaning inside. He tried to open the door, but it was locked, so he grabbed another passerby, and they were able to break down the door. And inside, on the floor, they found Ciriaco Brancoli in a pool of blood, moaning. They took him to the hospital. He died a few days later, and he never told them why he killed himself. What we do know is the method he used, which was gruesome. He had a very dull penknife, and he jammed it in his throat. So, of course, he couldn't tell anybody why he killed himself, but that's all we know about Ciriaco Brancoli, the shoemaker.
And you think, since it was dull, he probably had to do it repeatedly.
Oh, I don't even want to go there.
Well, I do. I have another sniglet, a little brief story about Roy Wesley Judge. And he's buried way in the other section. He doesn't have a stone. But he was a tailor. He was 19 years old in 1911, and he was married when he died of lead poisoning. He got shot in the neck. He got shot in the neck while attempting to rob 2 Greek laborers in a sleeping car in a train. And the guy, one of the laborers shot and killed him. I went to the Center for Sacramento History and I found the Coroner's Inquest Index book, but we couldn't find the actual report, but it did say it was ruled justifiable homicide. And I looked through all the newspapers at that time period, 4 daily newspapers for a week, and I didn't find any notice of that death, which is kind of odd. But anyway, we're going to go on and meet a milliner next, which is a lady's hat maker. Right up this way. Okay, this is the Van Alstyne plot, and she's on your flyer on the front page. She is the milliner, Lucy Van Alstyne. And a milliner sold women's hats, but they often would sell other items as well, like mittens, muffs, shawls, purses, jewelry, etc. She died in 1924 at age 82. She was married to Oscar Van Alstyne, who ran a trucking business in the pre-automobile days. They lived at a house at 709 I Street, which was raised with jack screws in the 1870s, and demolished in 1940 to make room for a parking lot kitty corner from the Hall of Justice. And the parking lot is still there today. And that's it. That's it. We'll move on right over here, actually, to the next plot here. See the soldier up there that kind of looks like it's almost turned gray from the sun, but it was originally more blue looking. This is John Trarbach, buried right here. He was a Prussian shoemaker who came to Sacramento in 1865 after his Civil War service. And I think there is an ad for John Trarbach on there somewhere as well. He took over a business around 1875 that had been the oldest continually maintained clothing business in town, starting in 1852. On the corner of K and 3rd Streets, he had a large store that stocked men's and boys' clothes. From the Union newspaper, Mr. Trarbach declares that he sells on a level with all competitors. He wishes it distinctly understood that he deals in no slop goods whatsoever, and does not keep auction stock, but that all his goods are in keeping with the reputation of this house, first-class selections. He went to visit family in Cincinnati in 1912 and died there at age 71. His body being shipped back to Sacramento for burial here. He was also a member of the Schiller and Veterans Lodges of the Oddfellows. The Schiller Lodge was the German Oddfellows Lodge. And in 1882, he was president of the Turnverein. He left his estate to his sister and nieces and nephews, which included lots 1 and 2 in the block of W and X Street at 5th and 6th Street, which was valued at $4,000. Sure they could get more than that today. All right, we'll be moving. This is the Moore family monument. Louis Moore was a partner in the Moore and York Meat Packing Company. They were big meat packers in the late 18th, early 20th, or late 19th, early 20th century. And the story is not about Mr. Moore, but about somebody who worked at the Moore and York meatpacking plant. Jacob Meyerhofer. He was the day engineer at the meatpacking house, and we're not sure exactly what happened, but he died in the meatpacking plant. He went up on a platform about 12 feet from the floor to oil the shaft of this large piece of machinery, and his clothes were caught in a pulley. He wore a jumper with wide, loose sleeves on the outside of his overalls, and he never buttoned it. He was well known for that. And the front was usually flapping around loosely. And either the sleeve or some other portion got caught in the machinery and wound him around the shaft. They found him a few hours later, lying insensible on the cement floor where he had fallen about 12 feet onto the floor after being wrapped around the shaft machinery. Both arms were badly broken. One eye was out. His skull was badly cut and fractured. Jaws and chin crushed, and died about an hour later. Mr. York of the Moore and York Company was very much affected by this accident, as a similar one had happened only a short time previous. This is before Cal OSHA. And that's about it for Mr. Meyerhofer. Buried around here somewhere, we're not sure exactly. Over in here somewhere. She was a laundress. 22 years old, died in 1907 of diphtheria, hopefully not related to the laundry. All the fabrics available back then would have been natural fibers like cotton and wool, the two most commonly used fabrics. Linens and silks would have been used as well, but in smaller quantities and more expensive clothes. Most women try to have at least one good silk dress. In case of fabrics that were not washable, they had a lot of things that they would do. They might line a dress with cotton or add cotton to the hemline to extend its protect against wear and extend its life. They often wore aprons over dresses, because you could wash the apron where you can't wash the wine stain out of a silk dress very easily. Brushing and folding clothes neatly before putting them away was a common method of removing surface lint, dander, dust, or stones maybe that you picked up that would have worked into the fabric and destroyed the clothes. Closets were not a feature of homes back then, regardless of income level. So many garments were usually folded and placed away in drawers or trunks if they were not hung from pegs on the walls. If you go to the Stanford Mansion or other mansions like that, you're kind of struck by, where's all the closets? They don't have any closets here. Popular cotton fabrics included gingham, calico, lawn, muslin, cambric, organdy, percale, peak, nankeen, and poplin. Wool and wool blend fabrics included flannel, worsted, cashmere, alpaca, woolen grenadine, and mohair lustrum. Usually laundering process was really pretty nasty and intense. The soap they use is usually, from animal fat and lye, and boiling hot water. They'd have big tubs full of harsh soap and boiling water. They would put the stuff in and agitate it by hand. They didn't have crank wringers until the 1860s to squeeze the water out. Most cotton and linen garments were starched before drying and ironed afterwards. The garments would be immersed in cooked laundry starch before being laid out, hanging out to dry. And the irons would be heating on the stove, and the clothes would be sprinkled with water before ironing. So it just sounds exhausting just to get a clean shirt. Maddie, are you ready? All right. You can stay where you are.
Well, the plot's right here.
Oh, okay.
So let's move down to
the plot is right here, so just come on right down here. Pay your respects to Mr. Klein. He's been waiting for you for 100-something years.
Okay, this is the Klein family plot. Conrad Klein was a cobbler, a shoemaker.
and he and his family lived and worked for many years at 605 K Street. Think about that address. They'd be very wealthy people if they still own that property today, because the arena couldn't be built until they sold it, but they're long gone. Conrad and his wife, Catherine, had 4 children. Conrad, like I said, was a shoemaker, and in 1891, he was unloading a shipment of something from a train car. It may have been a shipment of leather or other materials to use in shoemaking, and somehow his leg got caught under the train car, and it had to be amputated. And his health deteriorated quickly after that, and he died a few years later, and he was only 63. Sadly, Conrad Klein outlived one of his 4 children. And since I don't really know much more about Conrad, I'll tell you the story of his son who died 8 years before him, his son Jacob Klein. Jacob Klein and Josephine Wiesel grew up together. They knew each other since childhood, and everybody said they'd probably get married when they grew up. And sure enough, they got engaged to be married. But Josephine, who went by the nickname Feeny, realized that Jacob had a very bad temper, and so she broke off the engagement. And that made Jacob extremely angry. And one evening in February of 1886, Feeny was walking home from visiting her sister-in-law. She was walking west on J Street, and it was about dusk, and who should she run into but Jacob? And he seemed to be in a fairly good mood. He said, "Feeny, let's go walking. I just want to talk to you for a while." And she said, "Okay." So they started heading east on J Street, and they walked up to 15th Street. Now today, 15th to 16th on J Street, that's where the Memorial Auditorium is. But in 1886, when this happened, there was a big grammar school on that plot of land. And Jacob said, "Feeny, let's cut through the schoolyard, and then we'll walk back down I Street." Feeny said, "All right." And by this time it was dark. So they headed into the schoolyard, and they walked behind the school. And something happened back there. Jacob claimed it was consensual. He got up and he left on his own, and he went back out J Street, and who should he run into but one of Feeny's brothers-in-law. Now, why would a brother-in-law to this woman be standing there at that spot at that moment? Jacob later said it's because Feeny and the brother-in-law were setting him up. It was a trap. Feeny claimed that what happened behind the school was not consensual. She got home, and her family realized something terrible had happened to her. Her clothes were torn, she was beaten, she was bruised, she was bloody. And Feeny Wiesel was never the same after that night. She had been a vivacious, popular young woman who liked to dress nice, she liked to go out dancing, she had a lot of friends. Everything changed after that night for Feeny Wiesel. She became forgetful. Her family couldn't leave her to cook a meal on the stove because she'd wander away from it. She'd leave the house forgetting to put on her stockings or her petticoat. She developed insomnia. Her sisters said that they would wake up in the middle of the night and Feeny would be pacing back and forth in the dark. And she developed wild mood swings. One minute she'd be perfectly normal, the next minute she'd be crying or laughing hysterically. And for good reason. Because within a couple months after whatever happened behind the schoolyard happened, Feeny realized she was a girl in trouble. She was unmarried and she was going to have a baby. So Feeny and her mother went to the Klein household, and they asked Mrs. Klein to tell their son Jacob to marry Feeny to make an honest woman out of her. And Mrs. Klein said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Your daughter Feeny is a loose woman. This happened before she ran into my son Jacob, and she's only trying to marry him to make her own reputation better." Feeny got desperate. Time after time after time, she kept going back to the Klein household and begging Jacob to marry her. Finally, she got down on her hands and knees and she said, "Jacob, I don't want you to live with me. I don't want your money. All I want is both of our names on a marriage certificate so that I can be an honest woman and I can raise our child with a name." And Jacob's response to her, he said, "You ask me to marry you one more time and I will kick you so hard you'll lose that baby."
Good.
Feeny was running out of options. She had one option left. She had one option left, and so she used it. She went to the hardware store, and she bought herself a gun. She bought a pretty little nickel-plated handgun that glittered in the sun. And as she took it outdoors, she realized if she tried to use this, people would see it, and they'd grab it out of her hand before she had a chance to use it. So she went back to the hardware store, and she traded it in on a gun that was made out of a dark blue metal that wasn't so noticeable. And she waited for her chance. And her chance came in June of that year. Feeny knew that Jacob played cornet in several bands, And one of those bands had a standing engagement every Saturday afternoon at the Plaza, what we now call Cesar Chavez Plaza. And she knew that he had a second engagement that overlapped with the first one. And so he always left that first band engagement before the last song started. So she stood at the end of the park one day in June, and she waited for Jacob. And when the second to the last song ended, she saw him pack up his cornet, get down off the bandstand, and he started walking towards her, towards the exit of the park. And we don't know if he saw her, but she saw him. And as they passed, the band started playing their last song, Home Sweet Home. Feenie Weisel passed Jacob, turned around, pulled that little handgun out of her bag, pointed it at the back of his head, fired one shot, and Jacob Klein was dead before he hit the ground. Feenie just stood there. She didn't run away. She was perfectly calm, allowed herself to be arrested. She was charged with murder, taken to jail. But there was an uproar because it didn't seem right to keep an unmarried pregnant woman in jail. So she was allowed to stay at home until the trial happened, and she spent her time at home giving interviews. She would speak to anybody who came to see her, friends, family, investigators, detectives, reporters from the newspaper. She'd give an interview to anybody, and she always had the same story. She said, Jacob Klein took my life from me, so I took his, and a life for a life is no robbery. But one thing that everybody noticed while they were interviewing her were her mood swings. She'd be perfectly rational for a few minutes, and then she'd start crying hysterically or laughing hysterically. And there was a theory in the 1880s that pregnant women were mentally unstable. And so the question was Feenie Weisel a cold-blooded murderess, or was she out of her mind when she shot Jacob Klein? The trial happened late that year, around December, and it attracted a big crowd of women and young girls, because every morning when Feenie Weisel entered that courtroom, she was carrying her beautiful brand new baby boy with her. During the trial, some ugly rumors came out about Feenie. Some people said that this wasn't the first time she found herself in this predicament. In fact, little more than a year earlier, she had gone to this doctor, and she didn't come home for a couple days afterwards. Wonder what that was about. Other people said absolutely not. Feenie Weisel was a virtuous, chaste young woman, and Jacob Klein ruined her. Ultimately, it came down to one sentence in the newspaper. In the case of Josephine Weisel, charged with the murder of Jacob Klein, the defendant was found not guilty. So Feenie Weisel proved her point. A life for a life was no robbery. But her life was a little bit disturbing for the next couple of years. For about 2 years after Jacob Klein's death, she kept getting anonymous death threats in the mail. And for a while, a mysterious woman dressed entirely in black, including a black veil, would pace in front of the Weisel house back and forth silently every now and then, and nobody ever figured out who it was. Could have been one of Jacob's sisters, it could have been his mother, it could have been a girlfriend, nobody ever knew. But that is the story of Jacob Klein, the son of Conrad Klein. Conrad Klein, the shoemaker. That's all.
To the public, concerning the case of Feenie Weisel, accused of the murder of Jacob C. Klein, I, the undersigned father of the murdered young man, to satisfy my own mind, consider it my duty to state that at the preliminary examination of the case, I insisted on having the said Feenie Weisel examined whether she was really in the condition she claimed to be. But her counsel protested against my demand. There are reasons to believe that she was not in such condition, and only pretended to be for the purpose of taking revenge on my son, Jacob C. Klein, whom she had selected as her victim. Anyway, we won't know ever, so those are the best stories when you're not really sure. All right, let's move on. This is the Harvey family plot. Sarah Ann Harvey was a glove maker. Glove making is a very precise and demanding profession because you got to have the kid, which is the fabric, got to be stretched really thin, but also not so thin that it's going to break. For women of fashion, any public event would have dictated wearing gloves. For the rest, they would have only worn them to church or weddings. When gloves were worn, they had to be buttoned all the way. For example, in the 1850s, a young girl was rebuked by her mother for wearing her gloves unbuttoned in church. "But Mama," she asked, "what is one to do if one's hands perspire?" Her mother answered, "My love, the perfect lady does not perspire." Which kind of sums up the Victorian era pretty well. For an 1843 etiquette book, "To appear in public without them, to sit in church or a place of public amusement, destitute of these appendages, is decidedly vulgar. Some gentlemen insist on slipping off their gloves before shaking hands, a piece of barbarity of which no lady will be guilty. Physical contact, except in the most private circumstances, was considered distasteful, and gloves served as a buffer against that contact. All servants, for example, had to wear gloves because you don't want a clumsy waiter's thumb in your glove and in your food unless it has a glove on it. From 1860 to the end of the decade, short gloves coming just over the wrist were preferred for all but formal occasions. Colored gloves became more popular after 1870. In the last quarter of the century, all women's clothing just went crazy in terms of decoration, with the surface of dresses broken up with frills, fringes, lace, and embroidery. Small accessories like gloves and hats, fans, and shoes became much more elaborate, with printing, embroidery, beads, and lace, and gloves got longer, also allowing more room for ornamentation. And that's it for Mrs. Harvey. We'll go on. If you look at your flyer, you'll see two names on it that are hatters. John Slater and Daniel Quinn were both hat makers. And Lewis and Carroll's Mad Hatter was based on real life. The process was really nasty back then. They used to steam the hats with mercury. So they're in a small room inhaling mercury. They used mercury to block the hats also, which is going to shape them. And it resulted in hatter shakes, tremors, delusion, hallucinations, uncontrollable shakes. People thought that they were drunk often, hatters. So as far as we know, Daniel Quinn and John Slater didn't have the hatter shakes. They both died at a relatively old age, 69 and 73, respectively. And John Slater was a member of the Odd Fellows, serving as treasurer, was in Republican politics and a Board of Education, died in 1915. Daniel Quinn had the largest and finest hat store in town, had a wholesale and retail business, imported his own stock, manufactured it here, and claimed he could undercut those San Francisco guys by 15% because of his location and didn't have to ship things out and store them on the docks. He also dealt in furs, new and repairs, and was elected to the Chamber of Commerce in 1896. And up here we have, this section we've got several bootmakers and shoemakers. Herman Gopel is buried over there. Joseph Vinemeyer is over here. We won't go and look, but we'll just name drop a few 150-year-old names that haven't been mentioned in 150 years. John Cromer is on your flyer also. He was a tailor and another German immigrant. And Jacob Kurth is down this way, and he was he's on your flyer as well. He was a bootmaker in business in Sacramento since 1857 on J between 4th and 5th. And we'll take a walk up this over here, and briefly we'll talk about Louise Dietrich Gardner, who's buried here. And he was a dressmaker who lived at 1237 H Street, and was a member of the Women of Woodcraft see, this is Woodmen of the World is the fraternity that they belong to. This is the type of stones that they would have. And the women's auxiliary of it was called the Women of Woodcraft. And she was a member of that, and the Turners, and the Howard Benevolent Association. And now I'll turn it over to Maddie for another horrible, tragic story.
Well, this is the story of the Methvin family, who are not buried here. Elizabeth Methvin was a dressmaker. She died in 1938 at the age of 92, and she was buried here until 1952 when her family had her moved to East Lawn Cemetery. So she ties in with the theme. She was buried here. Elizabeth had a daughter named Maud, and Maud worked at Weinstock's. Now, the Methvin family lived a very quiet, ordinary life, nothing to tell about them, except for the run-in that they had with a terrible, drunken tailor named... God, my name just went on. Well, he was listed by 9 different names in the newspaper. His last name was either Barry, B-E-R-R-Y, or Barry, B-U-R-Y. His first name could have been John, Jack, Anton, Antone, Antoine, or Antoine J. I'm just going to call him Anton Barry for the story. One evening in 1896, the Methvins heard a knock on their door, and they answered it, and it was Anton Barry, who they didn't know. He was just this young guy, about 21, 22 years old, at the door, and Elizabeth said, "Can I help you?" And Anton said, "I want to speak to your daughter Maud in private." And Maud peeked around the door, and she didn't know this guy either, and she said, "If you have something to say to me, you can say it in front of my mother." Well, Anton didn't have something to say to her. He had something to do. He reached in his pocket, pulled out a handgun, and as he went to shoot Maud, Elizabeth slammed the door on him, but he got his arm inside the door and he managed to fire off one shot. Fortunately, it went into the wall and it didn't hit Maud or Elizabeth. But after that happened, he pulled his arm out of the door, and Elizabeth opened the door to see who he was and why he was doing this, and he put the gun to his head. The neighbors heard the commotion from the gunshot, so they came running, and when he saw them, he turned and he pointed the gun at the neighbors. And during all this commotion, Elizabeth, who kept a smart head, managed to grab that gun out of his hand. Anton Barry did not run away. He just kind of slowly sauntered off, which meant that the police were able to catch him within a block. They took him to jail and charged him with attempted murder, and they tried to figure out who was this guy and why was he trying to shoot Maud Methvin. The Methvins didn't know him at all. Anton Barry said he had been dating Maud Methvin for 4 or 5 years, but he didn't know why he wanted to kill her. Anton's family and friends came to the jail to talk to the police, and the police gradually learned the story of Anton Barry. Even though he was very young, only about 21, 22 years old, he had been a hard drinker for many years. In fact, he was very intoxicated when they picked him up after he tried to shoot Maud. His mother said that he had spent some time at an establishment called Dr. Corey's Gold Cure, which sounds like it might have been a 19th century version of the Betty Ford Clinic, but it didn't help him. He didn't dry out. His friends had all kinds of funny stories about what a great guy Anton was when he was drunk. He was hilarious when he was drunk. There was this time when he found this big butcher knife, and he went down the street waving it back and forth, trying to kill an invisible enemy. That was hilarious. And then there was this other time where he put on his spurs, and he tried to climb on top of a big sack of potatoes because he thought it was his horse. That was a crack up. And then he fell in love with this girl who worked at Weinstock's, this girl named Maud Methvin, but he was too afraid to talk to her, so all his friends wrote love letters, and they signed Maud's name to them, and they gave the letters to Anton. And when he was drunk, he got so upset because he was afraid to talk to this girl that, he went and tried to shoot her. That wasn't so funny. Well, everybody felt sorry for this poor young drunken tailor. And the judge sentenced him to 3 months in jail. The attempted murder charge was dropped, and he was charged with simple assault, given 3 months in jail. And he swore to the judge he would live a life of sobriety when he got out. Yeah, that lasted about 10 months. Then he was back in jail, again for threatening Maud Methvin. And this time we don't know what he did because the newspapers didn't describe it, but by now she was afraid of him. At first the Methvins felt sorry for him, but when it started happening again and again, they realized this guy was serious and he was dangerous. So he was arrested, charged with threatening Maud, but the judge didn't know what to do with him at this point because jail didn't seem to help him. So the judge had him committed to the insane asylum in Stockton. He spent a couple months there, and he was released, supposedly cured, but not. December of 1897, he was back in town. This time, he showed up at Dr. Corey's Gold Cure. And to announce his arrival, he fired 3 shots into the sidewalk outside the front door. Dr. Corey came running out to see what was going on, and Anton said, "Dr. Corey, I'm drunk. I need a dose of that cure, and I am going to kill Maud Methvin." Dr. Corey got him inside, gave him a dose of the cure, which could have been laudanum or something, we don't know what it was, and ran to get the police. But before he ran off, Anton Berry fired 1 more shot into the floor of the cure, just to make everybody know he was there. The police came. By the time they got there to pick him up, the cure was working. He was practically passed out on the floor. They hauled him off to jail again, but this time he was only charged with simple drunkenness. He only got 24 hours in jail, and he was let loose again. 2 months later, Elizabeth Methvin was walking down the street, and who should she see but Anton Berry walking towards her. She immediately got the police involved. Anton was arrested, but there was a problem this time. He wasn't drunk, and he didn't have a weapon on him, so they couldn't keep him. So just as they were about to let him go, Anton turned to the sheriff and said, "By the way, do you happen to have a warrant for my arrest from Stockton?" The sheriff said, "Come back in here, sit down for a minute." And he wired the police in Stockton, and sure enough, after Anton got out of the insane asylum down there, he worked for a while at some business, and he embezzled money. So he was wanted in Stockton. So the police in Sacramento held on to him until the police from Stockton could come and get him, and the Methvins were safe for a while. Just for a while. A year later, Anton was back in town. This time, he didn't go after Maud Methvin. He went to a photography studio, and he attacked the elderly photographer, beat him up, and stole his hat. When he was arrested, he didn't deny the charges. He said, "I don't know, I guess they did it, I was drunk." The judge charged him and sentenced him to either 50 days in jail or a $50 fine, and we don't know which one he took. Surprisingly, that's the last time we see Anton Berry getting in trouble in Sacramento. He doesn't show up in the papers for another 4 or 5 years, and this time he's found in Orange County. He married a woman named Margaret, so obviously he finally got over his obsession with Maud Methvin. He married Margaret, and then 4 months later he died. Now you can speculate all you want about guns and booze, but we don't know what killed him. He was only 29 years old, but that finally was the end of the terrible trials of the terrible drunken tailor and the Methvin family.
Wow.
Adam Nessel and Henry Garb were German tailors in business together, and maybe more. Henry Garb, in 1860, a 32-year-old Garb ran a foot race against butcher William Arnold for a bet of $20 and beer for the crowd. And as he lost the race because he gave the guy a block head start, and he couldn't catch up to him. And the race ended at the Columbus Brewery, and there were several hundred men there, so I'm guessing it cost him more than that $20 to get them drunk. He was also fined $10 in 1872 for using bad language, but since he was German, maybe they just misunderstood him. In the Adam Nessel, in his cemetery index, it mentions his cause of death is anemia, a blood disease. But on April 18th, 89, he visited the German hospital in San Francisco, where they amputated his leg, and he died 10 days later. So if you could say the cause of death is anemia, then I guess so. But upon his partner Nessel's death, Henry Garb bought out his interest in the tailor shop for $1,100. And a few months later, a fire gutted the shop, and he barely escaped with his life. And Garb died a year later. Henry Garb is right here. Both were lifetime bachelors, and they're buried in the same plot here. Actually, if you go to the other side of the stone, you'll see Adam Nessel's name on this side of the stone, and Henry Garb's name on this side of the stone. I don't want to make any unfair claims or against them or anything, but we don't know really anything about most people's personal lives at this time because they kept it personal for good reason. But if there were a profession in which two gay men could thrive, you would think tailoring would be it. Garb's family was firmly working class. According to probate records, half of his estate went to his brother Frederick, a coachman for a private family in Philadelphia. The other went to his brother's widow and 4 children in Germany. The widow had the 10-year-old living with her, and the other 3, the oldest being 16, were all farmed out as servants to other families. Yeah. Also buried in this plot right over here, there's about 4 people buried here, is the Bowden family. Unrelated, not tailors or anything, but E.J. Bowden was a one-armed collector. He collected business licenses from street peddlers. The licenses cost $3 if they went down to City Hall, but if he caught them on the street without a license, he could charge them $4 and pocket 2 of it. Or at least that's what he told the judge when he was arrested for blackmailing and overcharging peddlers. All right, All right, let's move on here. We're going to go over this way through this lovely little... Okay. This is the grave of tailor shoemaker Robert Reuter. Another good German, member of the Turners and Oddfellows. His wife, Elizabeth, lived for another 50 years after his death, apparently never remarrying. 2 of their young children are buried here. Joseph, who died a year or so before his father, and Adolf, who died 2 years after his father. Poor Elizabeth. The Sacramento Union newspaper claims that the index here at the cemetery says he died from septicemia, which is horrible enough. But the newspaper said he died from erysipelas caused by a badly diseased tooth. Erysipelas is a horrible skin disease. It's a swine disease. And in either way sounds just really horrible. But anyway, we're going to hear about wardrobe malfunctions in a minute, but I just wanted to mention, go ahead if you want to get set up. I want to mention the reform movement. There was a dress reform movement. This is a picture here of Amelia Bloomer wearing her famous Bloomer outfit that caused so much controversy. And look at it and see if you can see what they got so excited about. It's basically just a dress with a pair of pants underneath it. But the women wearing this outfit were the butt of jokes, and if they appeared in public, they were publicly humiliated, often by other women. Husbands, satirists, ministers reacted very emotionally to the garments that seemed to obscure, even to a minuscule degree, the traditional separation of roles and appearances between the sexes. One of the main comments was that it tended to de-sex women, as if you could do that, or made them more like men. This association made many women who might have wanted to wear the Bloomer outfit on a rational level to not be able to actually adopt it because they would be accused of unsexing their gender. Anyway, there were various dress reform movements throughout the century. This one, the Bloomer outfit, was from 1851. It never really had very much popularity, and eventually women's fashion would change in the 1890s to be less restrictive when bicycles came about and women needed to move more freely, and as women entered the workforce and needed to move more freely. And actually, hoop skirts were were complemented by Amelia Bloomer as a rational alternative to corsets, because corsets were very binding and very weighed the body down a lot, and the hoops ended up taking some of that weight away. And we'll hear more about hoop skirts from Maddie right now. Maddie.
Right back here along this aisle, you can see that tall obelisk. That is the Bugbee family plot. Mary Jane Bugbee liked to dress nice. And why not? She was 34 years old. She had a very wealthy husband. She could afford nice clothing, so she liked it. Her husband Benjamin had been a sheriff during the Civil War, and he retired from that position at a fairly young age, so he was able to reinvent himself. And he did that by buying some property and planting grapes, and he became very wealthy by selling wine grapes to the wineries in Sacramento. The Bugbee family property was about a mile from the town of Mormon Island. Now, if you want to visit Mormon Island today, you have to go to the bottom of Folsom Lake. Because when the lake and the dam were created, Mormon Island happened to be right in the center of where the lake would be. Last summer during the drought, you may have heard that because the water level was so low, you could see the foundations of some of the buildings from Mormon Island if you went out to Folsom Lake. But in 1869, when this story takes place, Mormon Island was a sleepy little town, but it had one thing that Mary Jane Bugbee needed. It had a stagecoach stop. Because one day in April of 1869, Mary Jane wanted to go to the town of Folsom. And to get there, she had to go to Mormon Island, catch the stagecoach, and the stagecoach would take her to Folsom. Now here was the plan. Mary Jane would ride her horse from the Bugbee property to Mormon Island. Her husband Benjamin and a foster child that they were raising would walk next to her. She'd get to the stagecoach, they would take the horse home, and then when it was time for her to return, they'd go back with the horse and pick her up. We don't know what she was planning to do there. We don't know if she was going shopping or visiting friends. We don't know how long she was planning to stay. But at any rate, this was going to be a big day for Mary Jane, so she was dressed nicely. Now, my dress is from the era of about 1860. Fashions didn't change quite as fast back then as they do now. So in 1869, Mary Jane would have been wearing a style similar to what I'm wearing, but of course she would have been wearing bright colors because she wasn't in mourning. She could have been wearing a floral dress or plaid or stripes with a lot of ornamentation on it. It would have been a fitted bodice with big loose sleeves. She would have worn gloves, a full skirt with a little bustle and a hoop skirt under it, and small boots or shoes, flat shoes, and a little bonnet or a small hat. If it had been winter, she would have been wearing a big coat called a mantle. But it was April. It was springtime. So she just threw a shawl around her shoulders. And the shawl was probably in a color or a pattern to go with the dress, and it probably had nice fringe on it. So here's Mary Jane all dressed up, and she's wearing a hoop skirt, like I said, and her hoop skirt was a little different than mine. I'm wearing the traditional hoop skirt, which is a series of concentric metal rings stitched into a petticoat, kind of like hula hoops. Mary Jane was wearing a hoop skirt that was one continuous loop of wire. Started at her waist, and it worked its way down and around and around and around and around, kind of like a slinky. So Mary Jane was all dressed up in her dress with her hoop skirt and her bonnet and her shawl, ready to ride her horse. Now, how does a lady dressed like that get on a horse? Chances are she didn't hike up her skirt and throw her leg over the horse. That would have been highly inappropriate. Probably what happened was this. Benjamin picked her up by her waist and planted her daintily on the horse side saddle. So Mary Jane is sitting on her horse. She has the pommel of the saddle in one hand. She has the reins in the other. And off they go to Mormon Island, about a mile away. And they got so close. They got within half a mile. They could probably see it off in the distance when something spooked the horse. The horse reared up his front legs. Mary Jane lost the pommel, lost the reins, fell backwards, screaming, "Benjamin, Benjamin, help me!" Benjamin ran up behind her, pushed her back up. She was able to grab onto the pommel, grab the reins. That was a close call. So off they go again towards Mormon Island, getting a little bit closer, and then the wind picked up. And when the wind picked up, it took Mary Jane's shawl off her shoulders and it slapped the side of that horse. The horse was spooked. The horse reared up his legs, took off running. Mary Jane lost the pommel, lost the reins, fell backwards again, and this time Benjamin wasn't close enough to get her, and she fell and tumbled backwards off the horse. And as she fell, the hoop skirt got caught on the pommel of the saddle. So the horse is running that way. Mary Jane is unspooling that wire hoop skirt as she rolls backwards off the horse, screaming, "Benjamin, Benjamin, help me!" the hoop skirt is unraveling, turning into a long wire, 10 feet long, 20 feet long. The horse is going that way. Mary Jane is rolling and screaming. Suddenly, the wire snaps. The horse keeps running, and Mary Jane's head is thrown back, and she hits a rock. Benjamin ran up to her, and he scooped her up in his arms, and she looked up at him for a second, and then she died. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the sad story of Mary Jane Budby, fashion victim.
Okay. This is the Mark Hopkins Monument. And no, he wasn't a tailor. Hardware store. They probably sold some functional clothes or something. But no tie-in. But it's just a wonderful monument. He was a notorious skinflint who, even after he, when he was still in Sacramento and he had already made it rich, he had a garden in his backyard that he would grow and sell the vegetables to his poor neighbors. And he would never have approved of something ostentatious like this, but his much younger wife that he married later in life did, and had no problem spending his money. And like I said, everybody in here... Oh, did you have a question? Good. Everybody in here, in this plot, was here before by 1849. The Society of Pioneers is the name of the group. There was a case of one guy who petitioned to join, who didn't make it by the 31st of December 1849 because he was in the bay on a ship that they wouldn't let him take a rowboat to shore because the storm was too crazy. And so he petitioned saying, I was there in the bay, I just didn't step on land. And they said, nope, sorry, you're not a pioneer, get out of here. But Lou Kalish was, and he is kind of buried close to that stone over there. Lou Kalish was a tailor and a druggist. He seems to have jumped professions several times, which is not unheard of back then. His tailoring business went belly up in 1859 after 4 years. Kalish claimed that he lost money every year by bad debts, which apparently was a common complaint with the craft. Hard to get paid for your work. And suffered losses in a fire in 1858. In 1875, he went into business with Jane Doherty, who took over the Boston drugstore after her husband James's death in 1872. The partnership apparently was not a good fit as she bought out his interest a year and a half later. In 1879, the Secretary of State appointed him as porter, I'm assuming for the Capitol, but he was in the 60s by then, so I'm not sure if that was a real job or a payoff or something. In 1887, the Pioneer Society here appointed him as janitor, which I hope was a honorary position because he was 79 years old at the time. All right, that's it for Lou Kalish. We will be moving on to Sylvester Tryon. You can see Tryon Merrill right there, and that's where we're going next. Oh, and I'm sorry, actually, where's Eric? Eric, come up here, would you? Just a few words about clothes. I'm a fraud and a faker. I am faking. This gentleman is a real deal. This shirt is not period. I'm faking that. The pants are not either. And I have a vest. This jacket is, hopefully when I do the tours you're paying attention to me and what I'm saying, and maybe the hat and the beard, and that's about it. But men's fashion of the time was, compared to women's fashion, not very elaborate at all. But men's fashion often, they didn't have to match. You could have plaid pants and striped shirt, stuff like that. Men's clothes, usually they didn't have belt loops until later on. Usually they just had suspenders. Pants were kind of boring. Shirts were kind of boring. The color in men's outfit was usually in the waistcoat or vest, which I have a boring vest also. But you could have paisley, plaid, very colorful vests. And of course, the hats and ties. And Eric is duded up very special here. He's got the gloves on. He's got his cane. He has a nice cravat. And I'm not sure what you call that collar, but it's nice. And he's got it. Why don't you say a few words, Eric?
Very few words. The only thing to add is the morning fob.
Right, you are in character as your coroner character, kind of, or
sort of. Yeah.
Sort of. Okay, you could pass anyway. Yeah.
I'm still fairly new to the cemetery, so I haven't really cemented a persona.
But yeah, you look great. And these two guys over here look great too, don't they? Thank you. Okay, any questions about anything? Go ahead and yell it out. We're almost done with our tour. We have about 20 minutes left. So follow us and you can hear some more story. Family plot. There is a plaque down here you can read. David Tryon, right back there, was a veteran of the War of 1812. And as far as I know, the only one that we have in the cemetery. We do have people involved in pretty much every conflict from the 1812 War onwards. A lot of Spanish-American War vets, Mexican-American War, Civil War, of course, and World War I. Actually, it's funny, the Spanish-American War in 1898 was popularized pajamas because they introduced them to the troops when they were in the Philippines. And a lot of the guys had never seen pajamas before, especially in the boonies. The nightshirts and nightcaps were known back then, but like a two-piece pajama thing wasn't really very popular back then. Anyway, Sylvester Tryon, who's buried right here, was a tailor and president of the Capital Woolen Mills. He was active in local politics, and his father was the guy who was the veteran of 1812 War. He marched in the July 4th parade in 1863 as the foreman of Engine Company Number 6, Young America Company, and was the proprietor of a large two-story stable at 10th between H and I Street. It suffered a fire in 1863, started by an arsonist who lit hay and threw it in the window from the alley, that caused a large fire that destroyed everything and anything nearby, including 15 or 16 wagons loaded with freight, fences, sheds, and other nearby buildings, and a blacksmith shop, and killed 18 horses. According to the newspaper, on Saturday morning, his name, Sylvester Tryon, had been announced as enrolling commissioner of the Middle District. He was appointed by President Lincoln personally to enroll people into the Army. And that evening, his place burned down. So the timing seemed kind of suspicious, and gave rise in the minds of many to the suspicion that it might have been kindled by someone who is in favor of peace and opposed to the war. I'm not sure if I like that wording very much, but you get the idea. He was a member of the State Agricultural Society, vice president of the Sacramento Library Association, on the board of fire commissioners, and funny enough, the Capital Woolen Mills burnt down again in 1874. The hay caught on fire one more time. A large crowd gathered, and most hung back and didn't want to help him because he hired Chinese laborers in his factory. He had 64 Chinese laborers, so most people just stood back and let it burn down. And he's on the fire company too, so he's got to know some of those people standing there not helping. And it burnt down, let's see, in 1886 another time. In 1894, and the second time it wasn't insured. So he didn't get to open the woolen mills back. He focused instead on his tailoring business. In 1894, he broke 6 ribs in an accident and was confined to bed for weeks. When he got back on his feet, he found that his friends had done the paperwork for him to be run for supervisor in the 1st District. Not only that, they had also placarded his name all around town. So he decided, what the hell, and ran. He placed a distant 4th out of 4 in the election, by the way. He died of kidney disease and in July 9th, 1895, and in an amazing coincidence, his brother died of kidney disease in Lake County on the same day at around the same time. All right, and that's it for Mr. Tryon. We'll go around this way to our letter. Charles Robin, and let's see, he had a clothing store. And I love this plot; is just so cute with this crazy bush that's here. And the fallen top is down here. He was from Montreal. He came to Sacramento in 1853, and after a few weeks of mining, decided it wasn't for him. He settled in Sacramento, and after some time as a salesman in a clothing store, he and his brother bought the business, his brother eventually returning to Canada, and he remaining sole proprietor. He was married in 1858 to the former Kate Hager, whose European father owned a calico manufactory. The steamer ship that she was on reached San Francisco about 2 p.m., and that evening they were married. They had 4 children, one son dying at age 15 and another at 5 months, which was all too common back then. In 1868, he built one of the finest houses in town. His daughter Malvina became Mrs. Albert Gallatin. And Albert Gallatin, at the time of his death, was vice president of Sacramento Electric, Gas, and Railway Company, a PG&E precursor, but was more famous for his house becoming the governor's mansion. Robin was also a director of the People's Savings Bank, and so he was well off. In 1886, he went to Europe with his family for 6 months, and then came back to Sacramento for the next 3 years, and after which he moved his business to San Francisco. He was a Democrat, an odd fellow, and a Mason, and as a high-ranking Mason was often a pallbearer at funerals representing the Masons. Let's see, he sold off his stock to Weinstock Lubin in 1894, and after that it looks like he was a capitalist for the Sacramento Electrical, Gas, and Railway Company. When he died, he left all of his estate but $10,000 to his wife. The $10,000 went to his daughter. And in 1883, he celebrated 30 years in business by, of course, having a sale. If you look at the ads back then, the language is different and more elaborate and verbose, but the basic concepts of advertising remain the same. Get them in with the promise of cheap stuff and then upsell. Also, you guys have been so great, so I guess we should talk about corsets a little bit. Corsets, if you've ever worn one, are not really very comfortable. Maddie, can you testify?
It's terribly inappropriate. I'm not wearing one.
Oh my God! Shocking, you hussy! Your bits are bouncing to and fro. Corsets were required for women in the 1800s, pretty much, from the age of about 10. Before women even started developing, they would kind of truss them up in these little prisms and basically went from the pubes to the neck, and it was like a what's the word I'm looking for? Chastity belt. Yeah, that too. And it made it. I mean, it was really hard to get into and out of. So really did limit your options as far as quickness. How do I put this delicately? But also, many doctors said corsets. Well, of course, doctors were kept in business by corsets or the injuries caused by them, so they didn't come out against corsets very strongly. But it was widely known that tight lacing was bad for you. So the doctor said, well, okay, just don't lace them very tight. But that's like saying don't lace your shoes. You know, basically, if you're going to put on some fancy outfit, you're going to lace it tight so you'll fit into it and look good. So tight lacing really could cause a lot of problems, and did. It wasn't talked about very much because you didn't talk about women's bodies. The word pregnancy wasn't really mentioned very much back then. But they could cause internal injuries, bending, breaking of ribs. A lot of women would use the tight lacing. They maybe wanted to get pregnant, or maybe they didn't want to get pregnant. There's not a lot of documentation, so we have to kind of read between the lines. But there were a lot of miscarriages back then, and it was known if you laced up real tight, you might lose that baby. So a lot of women made that choice. There were special pregnancy corsets also that were adjustable over here, but it's basically the same thing, just with a little belt that loosens up. You're still in the same straitjacket where you can't move very much, and that didn't change until around the turn of the century, with women entering the workforce and a variety of things. And then, like I said, there were reform dress movements starting in 1851 and through the years, but they were never very popular until it was more practical and you needed to have loose-fitting garments to be able to work or to ride bicycles and stuff. All right, that's about it on corsets, unless anybody has something else to throw in. All right, we have one more horrible story for you. It's in the corner here, and it's Joe Hummel, Taylor.
Mulch. If you walk west on our street today, you'll end up at a bridge that takes you over the freeway, and it's a narrow bridge for pedestrians and bicyclists, and it takes you across the freeway to this little plaza. It's very attractive, and people like to stop and sit there and admire the view of the river. It's a very nice little place to stop. But in 1876, it didn't look like that. In 1876, our street went straight to the wharf, to the river. It was an industrial area, and people didn't hang out there for pretty views of the river. So it was kind of surprising one night in 1876 when a night watchman saw a man roaming around that area of our street, and he saw the man walk between two piles of lumber and disappear, and then a few seconds later he heard a splash. And he realized the man had probably jumped into the river. So he took a long plank and he ran to the edge of the wharf and he looked down, and the man was face down in the river, and he tried to get his attention with the plank to get him to hold on, but the man just sank in the water and disappeared. A few minutes later, a light blue dress coat and a soft black wool hat were found on the wharf. There was no note in the coat, there was no identification, but there were 4 photographs found in one of the coat pockets. The next morning, Joseph Hummel didn't show up for work. Eric's research says that he was a tailor. The research that I did, and I think Eric also found some research indicating he was a shoemaker, so I'm not quite sure what his career was, but it had something to do with one of those fields.
He was born in Germany. He moved to Philadelphia as a young man, and in 1852 he moved to San Francisco. He worked either as a tailor or a shoemaker for a couple years, saved his money. He went back to Germany. He married a woman named Louisa. They had a baby they named Agnes, and in 1857 they came back to California and they settled in Sacramento, where Joseph took up his business again, and Louisa taught embroidery from their home, and they had a few more children, and everything seemed fine in the Hummel home. But apparently everything wasn't fine, because in 1876, Louisa filed for divorce, and she claimed extreme cruelty and failure to support. Coincidentally, the morning that Joseph didn't show up for work was the deadline for him to answer to those charges. So the police put two and two together, and they figured it was Joseph who jumped in the river and killed himself. They went to the Hummel home to talk to Louisa, and when she opened the door, she noticed that somebody had slipped a letter under the door. And she picked it up and read it, and sure enough, it was a note from Joseph telling her what he was planning to do. And when the police showed her the 4 photographs that they found in the coat pocket, she said, "Yeah, those are our children." As a sad footnote to Joseph's story, his daughter Agnes, the baby who was born in Germany, she was 19 when her father killed himself. Agnes never married. She worked at Bruner's, the furniture store, for many years. And in 1929, when she was 72 years old, she also killed herself. And that's all we know about the Hummels.
Yeah, not all tailors and shoemakers were suicidal, though. Some were, some were homicidal. I can't believe we forgot about the follow-up to the Klein story.
What follow-up?
The murder. Where's Jean? You know that story? Jean, you know the follow-up to the Klein murder? Okay, I don't have my notes here, but briefly, I think in when was the Klein murder?
1886.
86. Okay, so about 1910 or so, there was a murder. And not very far, I think close to where the target is. And a young fellow murdered a woman. Apparently, she wanted him to marry her, and he refused. And he strangled her. And it turns out that he was the son of Feeney Wiesel and Jacob Klein.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, incredible.
Wow.
So anyway, that's it for our tour today. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Come back. We have, now that we've started our season, we'll have a tour every 3-4 weeks. Look, we have flyers up front, bookmarks that you can take with you. April 11th, and what's that one? Kids tour. Okay. Okay. And the Iron Rangers up front if you want to make a donation. We're on Facebook and on the internet too if you want to look us up. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.